There'll be a timer, you'll see like, there'll be seconds, you'll see at the
You
top.
mean like it'll actually take a moving picture of me?
Okay, you could do that too.
I'm just screwing around. Okay, let's begin. The thing I asked you to do last night was to look at a range of Gatsby essays to get some familiarity. What I was about to say about the paperlessness is I'm still obviously going to have some adjustments to make. But that said, what I want to do today is I'm working from the assumption that you read that range of essays. You saw some student samples that go all the way down to what you could recognize as being inadequate. But I want to look at the next couple of days with you. There is a study guide for the stranger that I posted that I want you to do for homework tonight. It's essentially like a long quiz. It's just the basic facts of who's doing what to whom and where, that sort of thing. If you look forward to the next couple of days, your homework for Thursday is to read a short story called The Guest and the Myth of Sisyphus, and then Friday's homework, or the weekend's homework, is to read another short story called The Wall. But I want to go now to the Great Gatsby. And historically, I find that rising seniors, or in other words, this year's seniors, last year's juniors, when I ask the question, which of the texts that you liked the most, or which text did you like the most in your 3 years of high school, it's not universal, but there's a pretty good consensus that students like The Great Gatsby. It's lyrical, it's accessible, it's short, it's filled with interesting drama and characters. There's a lot of things to recommend it. But it also makes, I think, a good introduction to some of the questions, some of the ways that we might interrogate a text, ask questions of a text. Now, I'm going to work from the assumption that although you're here because you chose to take AP English, I'm not working from the assumption that you're a bunch of English majors. I'm working from the assumption, though, that you do have an academic interest in how to best read and respond to literature. So I kind of am going back, not necessarily to the drawing board, but taking a couple of giant steps back to remind us when we're talking about literature what we're talking about. So I'm giving you a bunch of rhetorical questions, a bunch of things to think about, some things to sort of scrape the rust off your memory about how we talk about and think about literature. So here we are. I'm going to try to make it big, but I don't know why it's not letting me do that. Because you probably can't see this, am I right?
Not well.
Worst case, you can just go to the computer and do it manually.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah, I'll do it that way. You get right to the heart of the clinical picture there.
Really, tech genius, I guess.
That's all right. That's good. Okay, so I wanted to begin at the very beginning. When we're talking about literature, we are talking about art. It's a made thing. It's crafted. It's designed with intent. For those of you who have an appreciation for or a facility in some of the other arts, musical arts, performing arts, visual arts, you know that art has about it a sense of craftsmanship. Therefore, we're going to work from the assumption that there are things that are crafted and therefore worth our attention in anything that we're reading together this year. I'm working from the assumption that literature is art. And I thought, to remind us of that, I'd like to give you a quote from Picasso, who said, "Art is a lie that leads to the truth." Yeah, it's made up stuff. The story of these dysfunctional people in New York in the 1920s, they didn't exist, they're made up. And yet they reveal certain truths that are worth our attending to. Now I want to begin today by perhaps reminding us that there is a basic difference between literary and commercial literature. As surely as there's a difference between high drama and The Bachelor. It's not to say that one is inadequate or whatever, but they're different. Things that have commercial appeal can sometimes be literary, but generally speaking, they work from two different logics. Commercial literature is meant to be an amusement, a diversion, something you read on the patio, something you take to the beach. Now, it can become something more. And I like all kinds of non-literary stuff. Real crime fiction, baseball books. I mean, there's a lot of stuff I read that is not literature, but I think we know the difference between commercial and literary literature. Everything you're going to be asked to consider this year is of the literary quality. It maybe had a commercial success in its day, but that's immaterial for our purposes. What I want you to do is recognize that if it is a made thing, if it is a work of art, it is put together with a certain amount of deliberateness and craft. I always have students who say, well, you're looking for stuff. Maybe. But that's what you do if you're going to be a good reader of worthwhile things. You're looking for stuff. So some differences between literary and commercial fiction. Some things for you to consider. Does it create a desire to read it again? Now, you probably are not future English majors. Maybe you are. But there are some books that you want to read again. Like The Great Gatsby is a great example. I'll give you another example that many of you probably have in your toolbox. The difference between Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer. Now, Tom Sawyer is very much worth reading. But it's a boy's adventure story written by a masterful storyteller. Huck Finn is a book that you can reread a number of times, and it will reveal itself in multiple layers. Now, it's not necessarily to say that one is better than the other, but they're different. If a work rewards reconsideration, it's probably literary. Do you feel compelled to ask questions like why and what's the significance of X? Why is that there? Why are these characters called? Why the Duke and the King rather than Fred and John? Why is that detail there? Does it matter? I've grown fond of using your own language lately. I've been thinking about how you guys look for like Easter eggs when you watch Marvel movies or Star Wars movies. I think that's a lot of what we do when we read literature. You're not going to pick up every egg and put it in your basket, but there are a hell of a lot of eggs that are worth picking up. Most serious authors clearly want to have a conversation with books and writers. I'm going to always work from the assumption that writers that are worth our attention began their lives as serious readers. Nobody just falls off the turnip truck and decides to write a novel. Chances are pretty good they've been serious readers of worthwhile things, and they want to enter into the conversation. One of the things I want to spend a little bit of time today is looking at how one of the most important, if not the most important work in English language that was going around in the time of the composition of The Great Gatsby was a poem called The Wasteland. And I want to share bits and pieces with you to show how that work, The Wasteland, is actually embedded and interwoven into the text of The Great Gatsby. Because good writers are good readers. Good writers are entering into conversation with other writers. What happens when you meet a novel or any work of literature? Chances are you look on the back. You see what kind of blurbs there are. You try to sort of, how you wait, you try to figure out a bunch of things, but when you meet a work of literature, you're kind of flat-footed until you actually enter into it. What do you notice? What echoes do you hear? I'm a big fan of echoes. And what I mean by that is when you read a work and you think, where have I seen this before? This pattern, this motif, this idea Where have I seen this notion of being in a wilderness for 40 days before? Where have I met this conflict? What echoes do you hear? Now again, I want to share with you in a little while some of the ways that the most kind of, I guess, influential work of the lost generation in the 1920s was a poem called The Wasteland. And how it's not to say that Fitzgerald was plagiarizing, but Fitzgerald borrowed the ethos. He borrowed the idea of that poem and wove it into his text, because that's what literate people do. What echoes do we hear? What is the dialogue, or what is in dialogue with this work? History, culture, ethnicity, etc. Probably the most difficult, or second most difficult thing you're going to read this year is Beloved. It's difficult because stylistically it's difficult. Once you kind of get into the rhythm of how Toni Morrison writes, it becomes a little bit easier. Stylistically it is a challenging book, but one of the things that makes it really challenging is its content, its subject matter. The main character in Beloved is a runaway slave who tries to kill her children when she's about to be recaptured. And she successfully kills one of her 4 children. It's a brutal story. But the question is, what is Toni Morrison entering into conversation with? Why write that book in 1986? Why that story then, by that person? That's the question. What is she entering into conversation with? Author's intentionality. We can't dig up Fitzgerald and ask him what he meant by Daisy's green light, and I don't think it's a good idea. But you can rest assured that there is intentionality in craft. If somebody sits down to compose a symphony, make a painting, write a novel, there's intentionality behind the craft. We don't know exactly what that intentionality is, but we can be assured that it will reward us if we're attentive. We don't know, again, what Fitzgerald's intent was, but I'm pretty sure he didn't just want to tell us a story about some dysfunctional people in New York in the 1920s. If we just looked at the plot, it's not a very interesting story. It is, but let's be really simplistic about this. Poor boy meets rich girl. Poor boy falls in love with rich girl. Poor boy is called off to war. Rich girl marries rich boy. Poor boy comes home from war, discovers his love has left him. Poor boy becomes rich boy, gets rich girl back, then loses her again and ends up dead in a pool. Sounds like a soap opera. Not all that, but if you break it down that way, of course, there's not much to it. But it's crafted. Human complexity. If you are looking at a story that does not seem to have much in the way of an appreciation for human complexity, or complexity of motives, or depth of motives, or depth of understanding, when you think about human complexity, that is one of the hallmarks of what makes a work of literature. That what we're seeing is something that looks kind of real. Now, Meursault and Hazel Motes may not look like us in any real sense. I can't see myself in either of those guys necessarily. But they are portrayals of human complexity. They are portrayals of a matrix of associations that we're supposed to sort of lean into and be prepared to decode. How does it function as art? I wanted to remind us of it. It is art. And Aristotle said the most important thing we can do with art is consider it. Consider it. This is a work of art. You might not get to a conclusive, definitive answer about anything, about Hamlet. Nor would you want to. But it certainly rewards your consideration. Judgments. Do not rely only on the intellect, but on emotions, imagination, moral sensibilities. Allow your mind to be engaged. It's going to be, I think, easy for us and understandable to have objections to objectionable stuff that happens in stories. When we see violence in stories, when we see language or things that we find not just objectionable, but outright offensive. This is going to act on us. But your judgment is wise if it's taking into account a host of things, including, again, why that? Why that detail? Why does the author choose this rather than that? So when you think about something like your judgments, your emotions are going to be stirred when you read about violence or when you read an act of violence. What effect does it serve? You know the difference when you're watching a movie between gratuitous violence, in other words, violence for the sake of violence, and violence that is in the service of a bigger part of a movie. What do you notice? What do you think the author wants you to notice? As I said yesterday, the essence of analysis is looking at the relationship between observed detail and overall meaning. Some things to consider when we think about plot. One of the reasons that reading a summary is usually dull and unsatisfying is because you're just reading the sequence of events and you're not getting what it is like looking at the score of a piece of music rather than hearing the music. It's like what one of my colleagues used to say, it's like asking your best friend to kiss your girlfriend and tell you how it is. Well, it doesn't make any sense. Plot and summary are not the same thing. Plot is a thing that's kind of unfolding. It has conflict, time and place, a protagonist and antagonist, suspense, mystery, dilemma. It has the things that engage us. Why does this pause happen here? Why does this flashback happen here? Why does this voice change from here to here? Why does Shakespeare, when he brings Hamlet back to Denmark, bring him back to a graveyard? Why? Endings. I always get this, it's one of those things that we get as English teachers a lot. Why does everything we read have to be sad? I still don't have the best answer for that, but I think it's the wrong question. There is a lot of literature that traffics in the tragic. The question isn't necessarily about happy or unhappy endings. The question is about effective or ineffective endings. If I asked you, how many of you have ever been disappointed by the ending of a story, a movie or a novel or a play, everybody would raise your hand. We've all been unhappy with the outcome of a story. Now, to my mind, there are two reasons why that might be. Either it was a second-rate work that got away from the author, or that ending was intentional. And if it was intentional, how are we supposed to decode it? What are we supposed to make of it? Effective, meaningful, illuminating endings versus ones that are perhaps artificial. Artificial endings are usually the stuff of melodrama. If it ends well, what I mean by that not is it ends happily, but if it ends well, where you get the sense that something has been resolved or satisfied or clarified or illuminated, that's its own satisfaction. Even if you wish the hero had lived, even if you wish that that romance would have blossomed, you still, if you get to the right end, it makes sense as a crafted thing. A couple other things to consider. Something that is at times called Chekhov's gun. Artistic unity means generally that there is nothing in a work of art that is erroneous or unnecessary. Sometimes it's called Chekhov's gun because Anton Chekhov was a short story playwright who famously said, when the curtain goes up on a play and there's a gun on the bedside table and it doesn't go off before the curtain closes at the end of the second act, it has no business being there. His point was that in a well-made work of art, there are no erroneous or unnecessary parts. Now, that might be a little bit overstated, because if you read a 1,000-page novel, I can tell you there's going to be a bunch of stuff that can be left out. But it's a good place to begin to think that the things that are there with intent. Another thing that is maybe a tool that could be in your toolbox is the notion of plot manipulation, sometimes called deus ex machina, which is God out of the machine, or God in the machine, where it's a plot device that sometimes people will dream up something. Like Hamlet was sent to England to get his head chopped off, but we got to get him back to Denmark. Ooh, I got it, a pirate ship. I mean, that's deus ex machina. It's an improbable introduction into an otherwise plausible story. But we continue. Now, what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about The Great Gatsby by giving you a little bit of a tone introduction to one of the, as I said, one of the most important works of the 20th century. It's a long, very difficult poem. And I say very difficult because it's not the kind of thing you get your mind around. What I'm about to have us do is the equivalent of rollerblading through the Louvre. I mean, we're going to be flying right past of some worthwhile stuff, and we're going to be doing it very superficially. But I'm doing it with a purpose, because there's some things in this poem that will make you smarter readers of The Great Gatsby. Now, you've already read The Great Gatsby, but let me give you kind of an overview of where we're going. The poem is called The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot was an American scholar. He actually had a PhD in philosophy from Harvard, and was living in London from the time that he was, a young man. I think he moved there in 1914, something like that. But he was living in London during the time of World War I, and he ended up being one of the most monumental poets of the 20th century, certainly the most influential of his age. And in 1922, he published, again, the most influential work in the English language for that generation, probably, called The Wasteland. In it, what he is doing is he is giving us a long, very challenging diagnosis of what's gone wrong in the modern world. For those of you who are history people, history fans, you might know that sometimes this is called a paradigm shift. A paradigm shift is when the world goes in a very different direction. You move from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance, that's a paradigm shift. You move from the Renaissance to the age of scientific exploration, that's a paradigm shift. Some people have said that World War I was such a paradigm shift. Before World War I, let's say the 100 years before World War I, from the end of the Napoleonic era to 1914, the opening of World War I, that's a 100-year span. And let's say that generally, that was a time of increased optimism, increased prosperity, a sense that the institutions of civilization were sturdy, predictable, worthwhile. At the end of World War I, we have something called the lost generation, and not just because millions of young men were slaughtered, but because they were lost, they were adrift, they were out to sea, they no longer could rely on the institutions that their forebears could. World War I was a game changer for a lot of people. As a tone poem of the lost generation, now I almost regret recording this because I don't want anybody to think I'm a simple-minded idiot about this complex poem. But as a tone poem of the lost generation, one of the things that T.S. Eliot is doing is giving us a diagnostic of a world that's gone sideways. And he begins with a reference to probably the first recognizable work in English literature, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales from about the year 1400 is generally regarded, there's people can disagree, but generally regarded as the beginning of literature in English. The opening of that piece, Canterbury Tales, paraphrases, "In April, when the rains come, men's hearts are stirred to go on holy pilgrimages. April comes, and we're reminded of the sacred. A pilgrimage is a journey with a sacred purpose. The beginning line of the beginning of English literature reminds us that April stirs in us the sacred. This is what the speaker in The Wasteland says. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. What once used to be a reminder of perhaps our own divine spark is now a mockery. April now makes us think about what we lost. Spring perhaps once was the thing that inspired holy pilgrimages. Now it's a mockery. It's cruel. I want to keep on going to basically give you like samples. Imagine we're just moving very briskly through this. The conceit of the poem is you have a pilgrim, a speaker, wandering through a wasteland. Something that has been devastated culturally, spiritually, religiously, that it's a wasteland. And by the time we get to the end, which we will in due time, but I want to give you flavors for who this narrator is. Because in many ways, this narrator, if you have this in the back of your mind, and you superimpose it on Nick in his version of The Wasteland, the novel has another layer that perhaps wasn't there before. What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images where the sun beats and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. There's a bunch of allusions that we're not going to bother to break open. But one thing that comes again and again in this poem is that our culture, our civilization, our institutions are now a heap of broken images. Imagine history that looks like a cubist painting that's just been splashed and kind of put together at odds and ends and angles. It no longer looks like something we can recognize. All we have is a heap of broken images. And he goes on, the pilgrim wandering in this wasteland. He goes to see Madame Sosostris, famous clairvoyant, had a bad cold, nevertheless is known to be the wisest woman in Europe with a wicked pack of cards. Now, it is a small detail. What once perhaps used to be the embodiment of man's achievement in intellectual life, what is now the wisest person in all of Europe is a gypsy fortune teller. We no longer can rely on the things that once used to be there for us to invoke. One last bit before we move on here. Burial of the dead is, I think, appropriately named. Why? What do we do with our dead? It doesn't matter what religious tradition you're a part of, or even if you're a part of no religious tradition. We don't just throw our dead on the ash heap of history.
Elliot.
Yeah. We do something with them in the off chance, perhaps, that there is something that is going to be recognized as their legacy, perhaps preparing them for the afterlife. There's a variety of reasons we don't just throw our dead in ash pits. The first piece is called the burial of the dead, because it's drawing attention to something that is essential to human nature, which is the need for the sacred. And yet, look at how it ends. That corpse you planted last year in your garden, has it begun to sprout? Will it bloom this year, or has a sudden frost disturbed its bed? Oh, keep that dog far hence, that's friend to men, or with his nails he'll dig it up again. Where there was once the possibility of God raising someone from the ground, now we have to make sure that we bury our dead deep enough so it doesn't become dog meat. It's a very de-centered world when we no longer understand the sacred. And then we have this peculiar line. You hypocrite lecture, mon semblable, mon frère. What he's saying here, the speaker, the pilgrim, you, hypocrite reader. You're rolling your eyes at what I'm saying, but you are my likeness. You are my brother. You don't think this touches you? Think again. Another place that we might go, we might go to religion, burial of the dead. We might go to that to find our way through the wasteland, but it's not helping. We might go to, the next one is a game of chess, which is a series of vignettes that shows what's become of relationships and romance and marriage in the wasteland. When we no longer have a sense of dedication or the sacred or whatever you want to call it that binds people together, when we no longer have that, what we have is a game of chess, a game of manipulation and conquest. You can't rely on marriage. Now think about that. Think about just that notion of how marriage in the wasteland becomes a game of chess. And think about how that might apply to the marriages that you see in The Great Gatsby. I'm going to skip a little bit more. If we keep on going through this, what you see is, again, a portrait of a strong diagnostic of a pilgrim in a wasteland who's wandering around, and again, you're not going to be able to, we're totally not doing this justice. I keep saying that, but this is almost laughably superficial. But you get this notion of a pilgrim making his way through a wasteland, through a desert, through a cultural, spiritual desert, looking for meaning, looking for some substance. And you think about that as a way of overlaying your understanding of Nick as the main character of The Great Gatsby. Of Nick finding his way out of the wasteland. On the third paragraph of The Great Gatsby, he says, "When I came back from the East last fall, I wanted the world to be in uniform and at a moral attention forever. I wanted no more riotous excursions into the human heart, etc., etc. I was done with the wasteland." Now, if you had the wasteland in the back of your mind, before or after reading The Great Gatsby, you become that much more, I think, in tune to the conversation Fitzgerald is having. I want to look at two more details of this. In What the Thunder Said, this is the final section. The pilgrim has made his way through the wasteland, and again, if there's a motif in this, he's saying, I need water. I need water. Like Moses wandering in the desert, he needs water. He wants to have all the things that one associates with water. Water, water, water. He's in the desert. Finally, we get to the point where What the Thunder Said. And I want to look at a couple of details here. After the torchlight red on sweaty faces, after the frosty silence in the gardens, after the agony in stony places, the shouting and the crying, prison and palace and reverberation of thunder of spring over distant mountains, he who is living is now dead. We who were living are now dying with a little patience. There's a bunch of references to the passion of Christ and ultimately to the Garden of Gethsemane and Golgotha. And there's a bunch of things that are happening in references. But the speaker is casting around to try to find some purpose. How do the pieces fit together? How can I make my way out of the wasteland? He gets to the point, again, this is all very metaphorical. Here is no water but only rock, a rock and no water, and the sandy road, and he's going blah, blah, blah. He can't find anything that is going to give him the nourishment he needs. I want to go here. Because this is right about the time there's a climax in the pilgrim's journey where rain comes. Finally, after making his way through the desert, rain comes. Now I want to get up to this climax and then go back to The Great Gatsby. Pilgrim says, "In this decayed hole among the mountains in the faint moonlight, the grass is singing. Over the tumbled graves about the chapel, there is the empty chapel, only the wind's home. Now, you probably remember the eyes of T.J. Eckelberg. Let me draw a line from Eckelberg to this. Now, T.J. Eckelberg is an advertisement for an optometrist clinic. It's not that big of an interpretive leap to make the case that we go to the eye doctor when we need to see better. There are a couple of other places that we might go when we need to see better. Perhaps one of them is a sacred place, a temple, a shrine, a church, a synagogue, to go someplace to see better. But just because people are no longer going to places where they need to see better, that doesn't invalidate them. The chapel is empty, but the wind is home. That's a reference to the Spirit. The chapel is empty. Nobody's going to the sacred places anymore, but that doesn't mean they still are not valid. As surely as the eyes of T.J. Eckelberg is a closed down clinic, that doesn't mean that people don't need to see better. And there they are, brooding over the whole wasteland of the Great Gatsby. The rain comes, and basically what happens is we get this enormous reboot, a civilizational reboot. Of the 5 great world religions, the oldest continued practice religion is Hinduism. It's the oldest of the 5. And the speaker goes all the way back to the very beginning, to the Ganges River Valley. And in the earliest recorded, continuous recorded history of God talking to man, it's in the Upanishads, in the Hindu tradition. And when God first speaks to man, he speaks in the voice of thunder. And he says his 3 great commands at the beginning are give, sympathize, practice self-control. These are the first things that God speaks in the voice of thunder. And even that little detail, practice self-control, I don't know if you remember this, but Daisy at one point says to Tom, oh, do have some self-control. You go all the way to the end. The pilgrim has made his way all the way through the wilderness, all the way through the desert and the wasteland. And the last verse paragraph says, I sat upon the shore fishing with the arid plain behind me. Remember, the final detail of the Great Gatsby is Nick walking across the shore and putting everything behind him and looking out at the sea. Shall I at least set my lands in order? For those of you who like mythology or the old chivalric mythology, you may be interested to know that another overlay in this is the story of the Fisher King. The Fisher King is the pilgrim. The Fisher King is Nick in the Great Gatsby, trying to find his way. So here's this figure who's made his way through the wasteland. He's got all the way back to the very origin of man's contact with God. And here are the 3 things that God says in thunder. Data, dayadvam, damyata. In Sanskrit, that means give, sympathize, practice self-control. And if you can listen to the voice of God, you will have these shanti, which is the peace that passes understanding. So this is a very superficial treatment of a poem for a very specific purpose. If we go all the way back to the Great Gatsby, and we think about how Gatsby, even though he's the object of the story, he's the thing that we focus on, he gives the title. What I wanted to do was I wanted to invite you for a moment to think about how this book is, among all the other conversations it's having a pretty significant conversation with a pretty weighty and very difficult poem. I want to look at the beginning and the ending of The Great Gatsby tomorrow, but I want to give you a couple things to think about. At the very beginning, in the first opening pages of The Great Gatsby, Nick tells us that all my life I've been privileged, and I recognize that I've always withheld judgment. I've been a little reserved. But now that I've said that, I want you to recognize that that has limits. One could make the case that one of the things that Nick is doing as he makes his way through this wasteland is he's learning to make judgments, learning to understand what is right and wrong. He says up front that there was something about Gatsby, an infinite capacity for wonder, that I disapproved of him, and yet I loved him. There's something about Nick as that pilgrim looking for something. And as if to punctuate that, the opening, I think it's the opening section on like the third page, he tells us, Nick tells us, that he came to New York, he came out east in the spring of 1922, which is a tipping of the hat to the wasteland, which appears in 1922 and famously begins with April is the cruelest month. So even that little thing, which you probably wouldn't know that that's an Easter egg worth picking up, but Fitzgerald's readers in the 1920s probably would have. They would have thought, okay, this is not just a story about these reckless people. There's something else going on. The other thing I want to look at tomorrow, you don't have to bring the book with you because I'll just read it aloud, is the final section, the final bit, when Nick turns his back on the arid plain and looks out at the sea. If you think about him as the pilgrim who's made his way all the way through this wasteland, it adds another dimension of, I think, brilliance to the novel overall. So we're going to spill over a little bit tomorrow. This is posted. You certainly can look at this. I put this together as a way of perhaps inviting you to think a little bit about how come this novel continues to fascinate us 100 years after it was published, how it's not just a portrait of dysfunctional people in the 1920s. So you can certainly read this at your leisure, and I'm going to look a little bit at these questions tomorrow as well. But what I want you to do now is start thinking, moving your mind forward and remembering the details of the story of Meursault. The study guide is, again, I think it's pretty straightforward. It's ungraded, so frankly, you can fill it out or not fill it out, but I'm going to be walking us through it, but I want you to look at it, okay? Any questions or concerns about any of that? I was tempted to go ahead and start reading the opening of The Great Gatsby today rather than tomorrow, but I only have 3 minutes left, so I'll just sort of, everybody take a breath and we'll do that. Oops, I should be masked up.